Okay, there it goes. All right, so I'm going to finish up chapter 9, which I think I left off on. Yeah, okay, page 169 at a convention of demigods. And I'm going to read all the way to the end. But I don't. There's another varying viewpoints at the end, and I don't want to read it. I'll decide when I get there. Okay. So on page 169, a convention of demigods. So, control of commerce, more than any other problem, touched off the chain reaction that led to a constitutional convention. Interstate squabbling over this issue had become so alarming by 1786 that Virginia, taking the lead, issued a call for a convention at Annapolis, Maryland. 9 states appointed delegates, but only 5 were finally represented. With so laughable a showing, nothing could be done about the ticklish question of commerce. A charismatic New Yorker, 31-year-old Alexander Hamilton, brilliantly saved the convention from complete failure by engineering the adoption of his report. It called upon Congress to summon a convention to meet in Philadelphia the next year, not to deal with the commerce alone, but to bolster the entire fabric of the Articles of Confederation. Congress, though slowly and certainly dying in New York City, was reluctant to take a step that might hasten its day of reckoning. But after 6 of the states had seized the bit in their teeth and appointed delegates anyhow, Congress belatedly issued the call for a convention, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Every state chose representatives except for independent-minded Rhode Island, still Rogues Island, a stronghold of paper moneyites. These leaders were all appointed by state legislators whose members had been elected by voters who could qualify as property holders. This double distillation inevitably brought together a select group of propertied men, though the once popular idea that they shaped the Constitution primarily to protect their personal financial interests no longer holds sway among historians. When one of them did suggest restricting federal office to major property owners, he was promptly denounced for the unwisdom of interweaving into a Republican Constitution a veneration for wealth. The quorum of the 55 emissaries from 12 states finally convened at Philadelphia on May 25, 1787, in the imposing red brick State House. The smallness of the assemblage facilitated intimate acquaintance and hence compromise. Sessions were held in complete secrecy with the armed sentinels posted at doors. Delegates knew that they would generate heated differences, and they did not want to advertise their own dissensions or put an ammunition of harmful arguments into the mouths of the opposition. The caliber of the participants was extraordinarily high. Demigods, Jefferson called them. The urgency of the crisis induced the ablest men to drop their personal pursuits and come to the aid of their country. Most of the members were lawyers, and most of them fortunately were old hands at constitution making in their own states. George Washington, towering, austere, and aloof among the demigods, was unanimously elected chairman. His enormous prestige as the sword of the Revolution served to quiet overheated tempers. Benjamin Franklin, then 81, added the urbanity of an elder statesman, though he was inclined to be indiscreetly talkative in his declining years. Concerned for the secrecy of their deliberations, the convention assigned chaperones to accompany Franklin to dinner parties to make sure that he held his tongue. James Madison, then 36, and a profound student of government, made contributions so notable that he has been dubbed the father of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, then only 32, was present as an advocate of a super-powerful central government. His 5-hour speech in behalf of his plan, though the most eloquent of the convention, left only one delegate convinced: himself. Most of the fiery revolutionary leaders of 1776 were absent. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Paine were in Europe. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were not elected by Massachusetts. Patrick Henry, ardent champion of states' rights, was chosen as a delegate from Virginia, but declined to serve, declaring that he smelled a rat. It was perhaps well that the architects of revolution were absent. The time had come to yield the stage to leaders interested in fashioning solid political systems. Patriots in Philadelphia. The 55 delegates were a conservative, well-to-do body: lawyers, merchants, shippers, land speculators, and moneylenders. Not a single spokesperson was present from the poorer debtor groups. 19 of the 55 owned slaves. They were young, the average age was about 42, but experienced statesmen. Above all, they were nationalists, more interested in preserving and strengthening the young republic than in further stirring the roiling cauldron of popular democracy. The delegates... My goodness. Let me take a sip one sec. Okay. The delegates hoped to crystallize the last evaporating pools of revolutionary idealism into a stable political structure that would endure. They strongly desired a firm, dignified, and respected government. They believed in republicanism, but sought to protect the American experiment from its excesses at home and its weakness abroad. In a broad sense, the piratical Dey of Algiers, who highlighted the need for centralized authority in foreign policy making, was a founding father. They aimed to clothe the central authority with genuine power, especially in controlling tariffs, so that the United States could wrest satisfactory commercial treaties from foreign nations. The short-sighted hostility from the British mercantilists spurred the Constitution framers to their task, and in this sense the illiberal Lord Sheffield was also a founding father. Other motives hovered in the Philadelphia Hall. Delegates were determined to preserve the Union, forestall anarchy, and ensure security of life and property against dangerous uprising by the mobocracy. Above all, they sought to curb the unrestrained democracy rampant in the various states. We have probably had too good an opinion of human nature in forming our Confederation, Washington concluded. The specter of the recent outburst in Massachusetts was especially alarming, and in this sense Daniel Shays was yet another founding father. Grinding necessity extorted the Constitution from a reluctant nation. Fear occupied the 56th chair. Hammering out a bundle of compromises. Some of the travel-stained delegates, when they first reached Philadelphia, decided upon a daring step. They would completely scrap the old Articles of Confederation, despite explicit instructions from the Congress to revise. Technically, these bolder spirits were determined to overthrow the existing government of the United States by peaceful means. A scheme proposed by populous Virginia and known as the Large State Plan was first pushed forward as the framework of the Constitution. The Virginia Plan's essence was that representation in both houses of bicameral Congress should be based on population, an arrangement that would naturally give the larger states an advantage. Tiny New Jersey, suspicious of brawny Virginia, countered with the Small State Plan. The New Jersey Plan provided for equal representation in a unicameral Congress by states, regardless of size and population, as under the existing Articles of Confederation. The weaker states feared that under the Virginia scheme, the stronger states would band together and lord it over the rest. Angry debate, heightened by a stifling heat wave, led to deadlock. The danger loomed that the convention would unravel in complete failure. Even skeptical old Benjamin Franklin seriously proposed that the daily sessions be opened with a prayer by a local clergyman. After bitter and prolonged debate, the great compromise of the convention was hammered out and agreed upon. A cooling of tempers came coincidentally with a cooling of the temperature. The larger states were conceded representation by population in the House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 2, blah, 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 blah. And the smaller states were appeased by equal representation in the Senate. See Article 1, Section 3, Paragraph 1. Each state, no matter how poor or small, would have 2 senators. The big states obviously yielded more. As a sop to them, the delegates agreed that every tax bill or revenue measure must originate in the House, where population counted more heavily. This critical compromise broke the logjam, and from then on, success seemed within reach. The final Constitution was short, not least because it grew out of the Anglo-American common law legal tradition, which made it unnecessary to be specific about every conceivable detail. It mostly provided a flexible guide to broad rules of procedure rather than a fixed set of detailed laws. The original unamended Constitution contains just 7 articles and ran to about 10 printed pages. Elsewhere, where civil law traditions prevailed, constitutions took the form of elaborate legal codes and were often strikingly lengthy. Indiana's Constitution, for example, which came into force in 1950, contains almost 400 articles and runs to nearly 200 pages. In a significant reversal of the arrangement most state constitutions had embodied, the new Constitution provided for a robust, though still legally restrained, executive in the presidency. The framers were here partly inspired by the example of Massachusetts, where a vigorous, popularly elected governor had suppressed Shays' rebellion. The president was to have broad authority and to make appointments to domestic offices, including judgeships, as well as to veto power over legislation. Yet presidential power was far from absolute. The president, as commander-in-chief, was granted power to wage war, but Congress retained the crucial right to declare war, a division of responsibilities that has been an invitation to conflict between president and Congress ever since. The Constitution as drafted was a bundle of compromises. They stand out in every section. A key compromise was the method of electing the president indirectly by the Electoral College, rather than by direct means. While the large states would have had the advantage in the first round of popular voting, as a state's share of electors was based on the total of its senators and representatives in Congress, the small states would gain a larger voice if no candidate got a majority of electoral votes and the election was thrown to the House of Representatives, where each state would have, for this purpose, only just a single vote. Although the framers of the Constitution expected election by the House to occur frequently, it has happened just twice, in 1800 and 1824. Sectional jealousy also intruded. Should the voteless slave of the southern states count as a person in appointing apportioning direct taxes and according representation in the House of Representatives. The South, not wishing to be deprived of influence, answered yes. The North replied no, arguing that, as slaves were not citizens, the North might as logically demand additional representation based on its horses. As a compromise between the total representation and none at all, it was decided that a slave might count as 3/5 of the person. Hence the memorable, if arbitrary, 3/5 compromise. Other items dealing with slavery appealed in the final state-signed draft, although, as with the 3/5 clause, the word slave was carefully avoided. The most notable of these constitutional elements touched the issue of slave trading, building on a sentiment expressed in the First Continental Congress. Most states wanted to shut down the importation of human souls, but South Carolina and Georgia, requiring slave labor in their rice paddies and malarial swamps, raised vehement protests. By way of compromise, the convention stipulated that Americans could import slaves until the end of 1807, at which time Congress would have the authority to turn off the spigot. It did so as soon as the prescribed interval had elapsed. Meanwhile, all the new state constitutions except Georgia's forbade overseas slave trade. Safeguards for conservatism. Heated clashes among the delegates have been overplayed. The area of agreement was actually large, otherwise the convention would have speedily disbanded. Economically, the members of the Constitutional Convention generally saw eye to eye. They demanded sound money and the protection of private property. Politically, they were in basic agreement. They favored a stronger government with the three branches and with checks and balances among them, what critics branded a triple-headed monster. Finally, the convention was virtually unanimous in believing that manhood suffrage democracy, government by democratic babblers, was something to be feared and fought. Daniel Shays, the prime boogeyman, still frightened the conservative-minded delegates. They deliberately erected safeguards against the excesses of the mob, and they made these barriers as strong as they dared. The awesome federal judges were to be appointed for life. The powerful president was to be elected indirectly by the Electoral College. The lordly senators were to be chosen indirectly by state legislators. Only in the case of one half of one of the three great branches, the House of Representatives, were qualified, propertied, citizens permitted to choose their officials by direct vote. Yet the new charter also contained democratic elements. Above all, it stood foursquare on the two great principles of republicanism, that the only legitimate government was the one based on the consent of the governed, and that the powers of government should be limited, in this case specifically limited by a written constitution. The virtue of the people, not the authority of the state, was to be the ultimate guarantor of liberty, justice, and order. We the people, the preamble began, in a ringing affirmation of these Republican doctrines. At the end of the 17 muggy weeks, May 25th to September 17th, 1787, only 42 of the original 55 members remained to sign the Constitution. 3 of the 42, refusing to do so, returned to their states to resist ratification. The remainder, adjourning to the city tavern, celebrated the toast-worthy occasion, but no members of the convention were completely happy about the result. They were too near their work and too weary. Whatever their personal desires, they finally had to compromise and adopt what was acceptable to the entire body, and what presumably would be acceptable to the entire country. Oh my goodness, excuse me. The class of Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The framing fathers early foresaw that nationwide acceptance of the Constitution would not be easy to obtain. A formidable barrier was unanimous ratification by all 13 states, as required for amendment by the still standing Articles of Confederation. But since absent Rhode Island was certain to veto the Constitution, the delegates boldly adopted a different scheme. They stipulated that when 9 states had registered their approval through specially elected conventions, the Constitution would become the supreme law of the land, and no states ratifying. This was extraordinary, seen revolutionary. It was in effect an appeal over the heads of Congress that had called the convention, and over the heads of the legislators that had chosen its members, to the people, or those of the people who could vote. In this way, the framers could claim greater popular sanction for their handiwork. A divided Congress submitted the document to the states on this basis, without recommendation of any kind. The American people were somewhat astonished, so well had the secrets of the convention been concealed. The public had expected the old Articles of Confederation to be patched up. Now it was handed a startling new document in which, many thought, the precious jewel of state sovereignty was swallowed up. One of the hottest debates of American history forthwith erupted. The Anti-Federalists opposed the stronger federal government, were arrayed against the Federalists, who obviously favored it. A motley crew gathered in the Anti-Federalist camp. Its leaders included prominent revolutionaries like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and Richard Henry Lee. Their followers consisted primarily, though not exclusively, of states' rights devotees, backcountry dwellers, and one-horse farmers, in general, the poorest classes. They were joined by paper moneyites and debtors, many of whom feared that a potent central government would force them to pay off their debts, and at full value. Large numbers of anti-federalists saw in the Constitution a plot by the upper crust to steal power back from the common folk. Silver-buckled Federalists had no power and influence on their side. They enjoyed the support of such commanding figures as George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Most of them lived in the settled areas along the seaboard, not in the raw backcountry. Overall, they were wealthier than the Anti-Federalists, more educated, and better organized. They also controlled the press. More than 100 newspapers were published in America in the 1780s. Only a dozen supported the Anti-Federalist cause. Anti-Federalists voiced vehement objections to the gilded trap known as the Constitution. They cried with much truth that it had been drawn up by the aristocratic elements and hence was anti-democratic. They likewise charged that the sovereignty of the states was being submerged and that the freedoms of the individual were being jeopardized by the absence of a Bill of Rights. They decried the dropping of annual elections for congressional representatives, the erecting of a federal stronghold 10 miles square, later the District of Columbia, the creation of a standing army, the omission of any reference to God, and the highly questionable procedure of ratifying with only 2/3 of the states. The Philadelphia newspaper added that Benjamin Franklin was a fool from age and George Washington was a fool from nature. The great debate in the states. Special elections, some apathetic but others hotly contested, were held in various states for members of the ratifying conventions. The candidates, Federalist or Anti-Federalist, were elected on the basis of their pledges for or against the Constitution. With the ink barely dry on the parchment, 4 small states quickly accepted the Constitution, for they had come off much better than they expected. Pennsylvania, number 2 on the list of ratifiers, was the first large state to act, but not until the high-handed irregularities had been employed by the Federalist legislature in calling a convention. These included the forcible seating of 2 Anti-Federalist members, their clothes torn and their faces red with rage, in order to complete a quorum. Massachusetts, the second most populous state, provided an acid test. If the Constitution had failed in Massachusetts, the entire movement might easily have bogged down. The Boston Ratifying Convention at first contained an anti-federalist majority. It included grudging Shazites, and the aging Samuel Adams, as suspicious of government power in 1787 as he had been in 1776. The Assembly buzzed with dismaying talk of summoning another constitutional convention, as though the nation had not already shot its bolt. Clearly the choice was not between this Constitution and a better one, but between this Constitution and the creaking Articles of Confederation. The absence of a Bill of Rights alarmed the Anti-Federalists, but the Federalists gave them solemn assurances that the first Congress would add such a safeguard by amendment, and ratification was then secured in Massachusetts by a rather narrow margin of 187 to 168. 3 more states fell into line. The last of these was New Hampshire, whose convention at first had contained a strong anti-Federalist majority. The Federalists cleverly arranged a prompt adjournment and then won over enough waivers to secure ratification. 9 states, all but Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island, had now taken shelter under the new federal roof, and the document was officially adopted on June 22, 1788. Francis Hopkinson exulted in his song, "The New Roof." "Huzzah, my brave boys, our work is complete. The world shall admire Columbia's fair seat." But such rejoicing was premature so long as the 4 dissenters, conspicuously New York and Virginia, dug in their heels. The 4 laggard states. Proud Virginia, the biggest and most populous state, provided fierce anti-Federalist opposition. There, the college-bred Federalist orators for once encountered worthy antagonists, including the fiery Patrick Henry. He professed to see in the fearsome document that the death warrant of liberty. My goodness, excuse me. I'm coughing so much. George Washington, James Madison, and John Marshall on the Federalist side lent influential support. With New Hampshire about to ratify, the new union was going to be formed anyhow, and Virginia could not very well continue comfortably as an independent state. After exciting debate in the state convention, ratification carried 89 to 79. New York also experienced an uphill struggle. Burdened as it was with its own heavily anti-Federalist state convention, Alexander Hamilton at heart favored a much stronger central government than that under debate, but he contributed his sparkling personality and persuasive eloquence to whipping up support for federalism as framed. He also joined John Jay and James Madison in penning a masterly series of articles for the New York papers. Though designed as propaganda, these essays remain the most penetrating commentary ever written on the Constitution, and are still widely sold in book form as The Federalist. Probably the most famous of these is Madison's Federalist No. 10, which brilliantly refuted the conventional wisdom of the day that it was impossible to extend a republican form of government over a large territory. New York finally yielded. Realizing that the state could not prosper apart from the Union, the convention ratified the document by a close count of 30 to 27. At the same time, it approved 32 proposed amendments, and Vain Hope issued a call for yet another convention to modify the Constitution. Last-ditch dissent developed. Oh my goodness. Last-ditch dissent developed in only 2 states. A hostile convention met in North Carolina, then adjourned without taking a vote. Rhode Island did not even summon a ratifying convention, rejecting the Constitution by popular referendum. The 2 most ruggedly individualist centers of the colonial era, homes of the otherwise minded, thus ran true to form. They were to change their course, albeit unwillingly, only after the new government had been in operation for some months. The race for ratification, despite much apathy, was close and quite better in some localities. No lives were lost, but riotous disturbances broke out in New York and Pennsylvania, involving bruises and bloodshed. There was much behind-the-scenes pressure on the delegates who promised their constituents to vote against the Constitution. The last 4 states ratified not because they wanted to, but because they had to. They could not safely exist outside the fold. A conservative triumph. The minority had triumphed twice. A militant minority of the American radicals had engineered the military revolution that cast off the unwritten British Constitution. A militant minority of conservatives, now embracing many of the earlier radicals, had engineered the peaceful revolution that overthrew the inadequate constitution known as the Articles of Confederation. 11 states, in effect, had seceded from the Confederation, leaving the 2 still in, actually out in the cold. A majority had not spoken. Only about 1/4 of the adult white males in the country, chiefly the propertied people, had voted for delegates to the ratifying conventions. Careful estimates indicate that if the new Constitution had been submitted to a manhood suffrage vote, as in New York, it would have encountered much more opposition, probably defeat. Conservatism was victorious. Safeguards had been erected against mob rule excesses, while the Republican gains of the Revolution were conserved. Radicals such as Patrick Henry, who had ousted British rule, saw themselves in turn upended by American conservatives. The Federalists were convinced that by setting the drifting ship of state on a steady course, they could restore economic and political stability. Yet, if the architects of the Constitution were conservative, it is worth emphasizing that they conserved the principle of republican government through a redefinition of popular sovereignty. Unlike the Anti-Federalists, who believed that the sovereignty of the people resided in a single branch of government, the legislature, the Federalists contended that every branch, executive, judiciary, and legislature, effectively represented the people. By ingeniously embedding the doctrine of self-rule in a self-limiting system of checks and balances among these branches, the Constitution reconciled the potentially conflicting principles of liberty and order. It represented a marvelous achievement, one that elevated the ideals of the Revolution even while setting boundaries to them. One of the distinctive and enduring paradoxes of American history was thus revealed. In the United States, conservatives and radicals alike have championed the heritage of Republican revolution. The pursuit. I had to take a sip. The pursuit of equality. All men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence had proclaimed, and equality was everywhere the watchword during this formative and tumultuous period. Most states reduced, but usually did not eliminate altogether property-holding requirements for voting. Ordinary men and women demanded to be addressed as Mr. and Mrs., titles once reserved for the wealthy and highborn. Employees were now called boss, not master. In 1784, New Yorkers released a shipload of freshly arrived indentured servants, on the grounds that their status violated democratic ideals. By 1800, this kind of bonded labor was virtually unknown. Most Americans ridiculed the lordly pretensions of Continental Army officers who formed an exclusive hereditary order, the Society of the Cincinnati. Societal democracy was further stimulated by the growth of trade organizations for artisans and laborers. Citizens in several states, flushed with Republican fervor, also sawed off the remaining shackles of medieval inheritance laws, such as primogeniture, which awarded all of the father's property to the eldest son. A protracted fight for separation of church and state resulted in notable gains. Although the well-entrenched Congregational Church continued to be legally established in some New England states, the Anglican Church, tainted by association with the British Crown, was humbled. de-anglicized, it reformed as the Protestant Episcopal Church and was everywhere disestablished. The struggle for divorce between religion and government proved fiercest in Virginia. It was prolonged in 1786 when free-thinking Thomas Jefferson and his co-reformers, including the Baptists, won a complete victory with the passage of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. The egalitarian sentiments unleashed by the war likewise challenged the institution of slavery. Philadelphia Quakers in 1775 founded the world's first anti-slavery society. Several northern states either abolished slavery outright or legislated a phased elimination of the institution. In certain parts of the plantation South, mostly in the middle states like Virginia and Maryland, a small but notable population of idealistic masters made personal decisions to free their human chattels, the first frail sprouts of the later abolitionist movement. But this revolution of sentiments was sadly incomplete. Despite opposition to further slave importations, the domestic trade in slaves continued to have legal sanction and, in fact, grew dramatically during the 19th century. It became a great financial boom for upper South states whose profit from tobacco cultivation was on the decline, and most of the emancipation laws passed through the North removed the institution only gradually, leaving hundreds, if not thousands, of northern blacks in chains until well into the 19th century. Some until the end of the Civil War. Finally, no state south of Pennsylvania abolished slavery, and in both North and South, the law discriminated harshly against freed blacks and enslaved blacks alike. Emancipated African Americans could be barred from purchasing property, holding certain jobs, and educating their children. Laws against interracial marriage also sprang up at this time. Why, in this dawning democratic age, did abolition not go further and cleanly blot the evil of slavery from the fresh face of the new nation? The sorry truth is that the fledgling idealism of the Founding Fathers was sacrificed to political expediency. A fight over slavery would have fractured the fragile national unity that was so desperate. A fight over slavery would have fractured that fragile national unity that was so desperately needed. Great as the evil of slavery is, the young Virginian James Madison wrote in 1787, a dismemberment of the Union would be worse. Nearly a century later, the slavery issue did wreck the Union, temporarily. Likewise incomplete was the extension of the doctrine of equality to women. Some women did serve, disguised as men, in the military, and New Jersey's new constitution in 1776 even, for a time, enabled women to vote. But though Abigail Adams teased her husband, John, in 1776, that the ladies were determined to foment a rebellion of their own if they were not given political rights, the civil status of women did not change meaningfully. Yet women did not go untouched by revolutionary ideals. Central to Republican ideology was the concept of civic virtue, the notion that democracy depended on the unselfish commitment of each citizen to the public good. And who could better cultivate the habits of a virtuous citizenry than mothers, to whom society entrusted the moral education of the young? Indeed, the selfless devotion of the mother to her family was often cited as the very model of proper Republican behavior. The idea of a Republican motherhood thus took root, elevating women to a newly prestigious role as the special keepers of the nation's conscience. Educational opportunities for women expanded, in the expectation that educated wives and mothers could better cultivate the virtues demanded by the Republic in their husbands, daughters, and sons. Republican women now bore crucial responsibility for the survival of the nation. And I think I'm going to stop there because my voice is really dying. But yay!